What if a forest could whisper the secret of a nation's downfall? What if silence itself became a weapon? In May 1940, as Europe held its breath, a storm of steel gathered behind the dark line of the Ardennes. Germany, wounded but unbroken after the Great War, was ready to rewrite the map of history. France, proud, fortified, confident in her concrete walls, believed she was safe behind the Maginot Line. But arrogance, in war, is the first casualty. The plan was called Fall Gelb, case yellow. On paper, it looked ordinary. A sweep through Belgium, the same path used in 1914. But beneath the ink, another mind was working. Erich von Manstein, a general who thought like a gambler. His idea: strike where no one dares. Send the panzers through the Ardennes, a region the French considered impassable. Let the enemy defend the wrong front, while the real attack moved through the woods like a shadow. And so, the blitzkrieg began, not with shouts, but with engines growling under trees. 500 tanks dragging dust through narrow roads, soldiers pushing stalled machines by hand, radio operators whispering coordinates into the fog. It was a dance of precision and faith, fed by belief in speed, in surprise, in sheer willpower. By the sixth day, the impossible became reality. German armor had crossed the Meuse River, slicing France in half. The French command, paralyzed by confusion, watched an entire strategy collapse in a week. 90,000 soldiers would fall. Millions would flee. The collapse was faster than Poland's, swifter than any campaign since Caesar's march across Gaul. Manstein's plan was more than a military move. It was a psychological ambush. It proved that walls don't defend nations, ideas do. And in 1940, Germany's idea was motion. Tanks as lightning, aircraft as thunder, armies as storms. History would later call it the 6-week fall of France. But behind that phrase lay a riddle of human arrogance and mechanical faith. How could a country that won World War I crumble in 43 days? The answer still echoes in the forests of Ardennes, where trees remember the sound of engines, and nations learn that imagination can kill as efficiently as steel. What does surrender look like when it's dressed in ceremony? When defeat signs its own name with trembling hands, and the victor smiles not out of mercy, but revenge. June 1940. The air in France was thick with the dust of collapse. German troops rolled through fields once painted with Monet's colors, now trampled beneath panzer tracks. Paris had fallen without a final roar, and the tricolor flag was folded away like a secret too painful to display. But the story was not only about conquest, it was about humiliation. Carefully choreographed, in a forest north of Paris, a quiet clearing called Compiègne waited. 22 years earlier, it had been the cradle of Germany's humiliation, the place where the Kaiser's empire signed its surrender in 1918. Now, Hitler demanded that same railway car be brought back from the museum where France had displayed it as a trophy. He wanted to reverse history, not just militarily, but symbolically, to make France kneel where Germany once had. On the 22nd of June, 1940, Marshal Philippe Pétain, hero of Verdun turned puppet of Berlin, signed the armistice. Cameras rolled. The Führer stood silent for less than 3 minutes, then walked away satisfied, like an actor exiting a stage he had just reclaimed. The numbers tell a cruel clarity. In 6 weeks, France lost 92,000 soldiers, 2 million prisoners, and its dignity. Never in modern war had a great power fallen so swiftly. The nation of revolutions was now split in two: the North occupied, the South obedient, governed by the Vichy regime. To the German propaganda machine, it was proof that blitzkrieg was divine logic: fast, clean, efficient, But beneath the statistics lay a deeper wound. How belief in walls and treaties had blinded an entire republic. France's leaders had built the Maginot Line like a monument to fear-thick concrete, narrow vision. It was a fortress for the past, not the future. When the storm came through the Ardennes, it simply flowed around the walls. The same mistake had been seen before. The Great Wall of China, bypassed by the steppes. The French forts of 1,870, shelled into silence. Even the mighty Roman lines, crossed by tribes who understood that borders are only ideas until they are defended by courage. France, in 1940, lacked neither soldiers nor steel. It lacked imagination. And yet, in the ruins, something stirred. Across the channel, a tall, defiant man in exile. Charles de Gaulle seized a microphone at the BBC and spoke 12 words that would echo across the century. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. That broadcast became the heartbeat of the resistance. In attics, cellars, and mountain passes, people began to whisper the forbidden word, liberté. The old spirit of rebellion wounded, yes, but alive, found its pulse again. History moves like a pendulum from arrogance to ruin, from silence to defiance. Germany's victory in 1940 looked absolute, but it carried within it the seed of its own undoing. The same railcar that served as Hitler's stage would, 5 years later, be melted down by the Allies. The metal that once witnessed surrender, now reborn as scrap for rebuilding Europe. Empires, like steel, rust in time. By the end of that summer, France had been remade into two shadows. One that collaborated, one that fought in secret. The occupier marched through boulevards to the sound of brass bands, while underground presses printed words sharper than bullets. The world saw the photographed soldiers under the Arc de Triomphe. Hitler gazing at the Eiffel Tower, but not the quiet defiance blooming behind every shuttered window. So what is victory, really, if it must be staged like theater? What is conquest, if it cannot conquer the will of the conquered? In the black and white frames of 1940, France seemed broken, yet beneath the rubble, the human spirit still smoldered, waiting for a wind to rise. And when it did, 4 years later, the same soil that saw surrender would witness liberation. The tanks that once dragged dust toward Paris would flee the other way. The story that began in humiliation would end in resilience. Proof that even in the darkest script written by history, light still finds its cue. What does defeat teach a nation that once defined victory? What happens when a flag still waves, but the soul beneath it has already surrendered? Summer, 1940. The lights of Paris dimmed, the boots of the conqueror echoing through marble halls. The war that was supposed to be defensive, the war of forts and pride, was over in 43 days. Yet the story did not end with the signing of a paper. It began there in the silence after the pen stopped scratching. When Marshal Philippe Pétain returned from Compiègne, he carried more than a treaty, he carried the weight of a broken republic. Once hailed as the hero of Verdun, now he became the architect of surrender. His government, the so-called Vichy Regime, presented itself as the new France, one that preached obedience, faith, and order. But behind the slogans was the shadow of collaboration. While German officers dined at Parisian cafes, French police helped enforce occupation law. The tricolor still hung on public buildings, but the heart that had raised it was shackled. Numbers told the tragedy with cruel precision. 2 million prisoners of war, 92,000 killed in action, 1,500 towns destroyed, and an economy bent to the service of Berlin. The French industry fed the same machine that had devoured it. Trains that once carried tourists now carried coal, steel, and in the darkest chapters, people. It was a quiet occupation, but no less brutal. Every empire knows how to cloak domination in normalcy. The Romans called it Pax Romana, the Nazis called it Ordnung, and France called it survival. But survival at the cost of honor is a wound that festers. The Vichy years were years of paradox. The Marshal spoke of saving France by submission, while others chose to save her by rebellion. In the cathedrals, priests prayed for order. In the backrooms, young men printed leaflets that said liberté. There was no single France, now only two mirrors facing each other, one that bowed and one that bled. Across the channel, Charles de Gaulle became the voice of the unbowed. From London, through the crackling static of BBC radio, he declared, "Whatever happens, the flame of French resistance must not be extinguished and will not be extinguished." His words traveled across seas, through radios hidden under floorboards, whispered from neighbor to neighbor. For some, they were a distant echo. For others, a new gospel. By 1942, the resistance was no longer a whisper. Saboteurs derailed German trains, networks smuggled pilots across the Pyrenees, and underground newspapers carried truth like contraband. France, carved and silenced, began to remember its own voice. And in that voice, a pattern repeated, one as old as empires. Rome burned and rebuilt. Greece fell to Persians and rose in philosophy. The United States once bled at Antietam, only to redefine liberty in its aftermath. Now it was France's turn to fall, to fracture, and to forge meaning out of ruin. The irony was almost poetic. Hitler believed that by occupying France, he had erased her. But in truth, he had only forced her to rediscover herself. While collaboration wore medals, resistance wore scars, and history has always favored the scarred. When Allied bombers roared across the English Channel in 1944, they carried not only bombs but retribution. On the 6th of June 1944 D-Day, the sons of those saved at Dunkirk returned to the same soil. The beaches of Normandy, once symbols of shame, now became gates of redemption. British and American troops stormed the coast under fire, while inside France, resistance fighters cut rail lines, sabotaged bridges, and guided the invasion. The battle to reclaim France was not just a clash of armies, it was a moral reckoning. Every bullet fired against the occupier was a word in the sentence France had been trying to finish since 1940. We are not defeated. When Paris was liberated on the 25th of August 1944, the bells of Notre Dame rang as they had not since the Armistice of 1918. Crowds filled the streets, crying and singing, as tanks rolled under the Arc de Triomphe, this time bearing the Cross of Lorraine, symbol of free France. De Gaulle walked through the city he had reclaimed, his head high, his words thunderous. Paris. Outraged Paris. Broken Paris. Martyred Paris. But liberated Paris. The same capital that had once bowed under swastikas now rose in defiance. The same people who had whispered in basements now shouted from rooftops. And the same soil that had seen surrender now tasted freedom once more. But history, like war, never leaves without a price. The liberation revealed wounds deeper than occupation, betrayal, collaboration, vengeance. Thousands were tried in post-war courts, others were executed in the streets. France had to confront not just what Germany had done to her, but what she had allowed to happen to herself. In that reckoning, She found truth, that courage and cowardice often share the same uniform, and that nations, like people, are redeemed not by denial, but by remembrance. In the years that followed, France rebuilt herself with a mixture of shame and pride. The same rail lines that once carried despair now carried hope, materials, workers, children returning home. The same factories that had built weapons now built cars, bridges, and dreams. Yet the ghosts of 1940 never left. They lingered in the photographs: Hitler at the Eiffel Tower, Pétain at Compiègne, de Gaulle beneath the Arc. Three faces, one lesson: that the real war is not won by tanks or treaties, but by what a nation chooses to remember about itself. The story of France between 1940 and 1944 is not merely about defeat and victory. It is about how identity survives humiliation. It reminds us that empires rise by force but endure only through conviction. Blitzkrieg conquered land. It could not conquer the idea of France. So, when we look back at those black and white reels, the trains, the tears, the flags rising again, the question is not who won, but what survived. Was it territory, power, or was it something quieter? The conviction that no occupation, no regime, no dictator can outlast the will of a people to be free? That question, like the echo of boots on Parisian stone, still walks beside history, asking every nation, every generation, when your honor is taken, how long before you reclaim it?